$60,262.09. Yes, after almost 3 decades of formal education and over $100,000 in tuition costs, that's how much I made as a resident doctor right here in Canada in 2023. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Darren and I'm a resident doctor based right here in Canada. If you're watching this in high school or undergrad and you're wondering if medicine is the right career for you from a strictly financial point of view, then this is definitely the video to watch. In today's video, I'm going to outline what you can expect to make at different stages of your career from when you first graduate medical school all the way to when you become an attending physician. I'm going to look at my own earnings in 2023 so you guys can get an inside scoop about the different sources of income that doctors tend to make in terms of the different types of work that they can take on. And finally, we'll get into the average salary or average earnings for 5 different medical specialties right here in Canada. Before I get started, I think it's important to note that this video in no way covers the intrinsic motivations for wanting to pursue a career in medicine, which arguably are more important than the financial aspects. Additionally, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritties of the cost of medical school in terms of tuition and housing and other expenses. If you're interested in that type of information, I'll leave a link to the video that I did comparing the cost of medical school in Canada versus the US in one of the top-hand corners for you to peruse at your own convenience. And finally, before I get into things, I've noticed that 95% of you guys watching are actually not subscribed to the channel. And so if you would be so kind so as to hit the red button below this video, that would mean so much to me. It really means a lot in terms of helping me continue to support this channel and produce high quality content for you to be able to learn about the journey to medical school. So after 4 years of undergrad and typically another 4 years of medical school, you finally have your MD and you can officially start getting paid as a resident doctor. Now for this video, I'll use Ontario salary scale as an example, but it is worth noting that across the country, every province has its own residency union. So the Professional Association of Residents in Ontario would be the Ontario Resident Union, but essentially the principles of how we get paid and approximately what we get paid is pretty standard across the country after you account for taxes and expenses. Residents in Canada typically get paid in one of 3 ways. The first is our base salary, which is to compensate the time that we spend during clinical care, seeing patients, interpreting results, making diagnoses, reviewing with our supervisors, etc., etc., etc. The other is on-call stipends for overnight and weekend coverage that we provide in the hospital as well as in the emergency department. And finally, if we choose to take on additional work, either in teaching or administration, we do also get paid for that work as well, typically here in Canada. Our base salary works on a seniority model, so the longer you've been in residency, the more you can expect to get paid. As a first-year resident here in Ontario, you would have made $62,227.83 between 2020 and 2023. As a second-year resident, you would have got paid $68,327.66, and as a third-year resident, you would get paid $73,382.59. Now this salary scale goes all the way up to PGY 9, believe it or not, if you want to be in residency for that long. But typically residents graduate anywhere between PGY 2 and PGY 6 or 7, just depending on what specialty that they went into, if they want to do any further training in medical subspecialties, or if they're just content with their specializations once they graduate. Now, that information is great to let you know what you're expecting to make as a resident doctor on the year, but how does that actually translate to hourly wages? The short answer to that question is that it actually depends on how many hours you work. So for the purposes of this video, I've broken it down into 40, 60, and 80-hour work weeks, understanding that depending on which residency program you go into, which subspecialty or specialty of medicine you'd like to work in, you're going to be working slightly different hours. So on the 40-hour end of the spectrum, you're probably looking more at specialties like family medicine, pathology, radiology or psychiatry. 60 hours is starting to get into internal medicine, some surgical subspecialties, and 80-hour work weeks are also not uncommon for surgical subspecialties as well. You're probably thinking cardiac surgery, neurosurgery, or some of the more demanding surgical residencies that are out there. So if we take a PGY1 or first year resident salary and break that down based on an hourly work week, a typical 40-hour work week would translate to approximately $29.92 an hour. If you're working 60 hours a week, that would be $19.94 an hour. And if you're really glutton for punishment and dedicate yourself to a really niche, very demanding surgical subspecialty, for example, that would translate to an 80-hour work week, which brings you to $14.96 an hour. In terms of my personal base salary for 2023, that amounted to $78,188.73. Now, you may notice that even though I was a PGY2 for half the year and a PGY3 for the other half, the base salary that I received was actually higher than the average of the PGY2 and PGY3 salaries combined. And the reason that is because, without getting into the details, our union reps managed to negotiate with the government that we qualified for an additional raise above what we were already being given. And so I personally was not going to complain about that. But the big picture is that these contracts get negotiated every few years. And so we are expected to keep pace with inflation, or at least in principle, that is what is supposed to happen. On-call stipends. So unfortunately for us, people don't get sick during regular business hours only. They get sick at all hours of the day, including weekends, including holidays, at any day of the year. And so somebody has to be in hospital to provide overnight coverage, weekend coverage, and coverage for all of those services outside of regular business hours. As residents, we don't actually have a choice in whether or not to provide on-call coverage. We do have to provide a minimum amount of on-call coverage a year, once again, based on what program you're in, based on what city you're in, based on the demands of the service that you're a part of as a resident physician. Now, here in Ontario, we get paid $161.86 to provide coverage from 5 p.m. to 9 a.m. the next day, which is a 16-hour shift and amounts to $10.11 an hour. Weekends are slightly better at $198.49 to provide coverage from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. That's a 14-hour shift and amounts to $14.18 per hour. Now, here in Ontario, the minimum wage is $16.55. So I think that speaks to the fact that you really need to love what you're doing if you are going to pursue a career in medicine, because there are some services that you will get paid less than minimum wage for. Now, obviously, you also need to be able to delay gratification because you'll be in residency for anywhere between 2 to 5 years, sometimes even 6 or 7 years if you choose to pursue additional training, before you finally are able to earn a staff physician's income. In terms of my on-call stipends for the year, I've estimated that that totals to approximately $2,007.92, which means that I worked about 10 to 15 shifts overnight or on the weekends or on holidays in 2023. Now, that may sound like a lot of money to you, particularly if you're a university student, but just given what we're being paid for these shifts, the fact that they're often on undesirable timeframes overnight, they can mess up your circadian rhythm, most residents I know are not actually volunteering to do more call. The one area that residents actually get paid relatively well on an hourly basis is teaching. So as a resident, you can volunteer to teach other medical students or sometimes other allied health professionals, and typically we make anywhere between $50 and $75 an hour for that type of work. Because these teaching opportunities are relatively well paid compared to our other methods of compensation, these opportunities tend to be slightly more competitive, a little bit more few and far between. But that being said, I was able to pick up a few teaching opportunities during 2023. And in 2023, I made approximately $943.24 from my time teaching medical students and other allied health professionals. So when we total my base salary, on-call stipends, and teaching bonuses, we get a total of $81,139.89. This is of course before employment-related expenses and taxes, but if you're watching this video, I assume that you care more about the money that's actually left in your pocket after you've paid for those taxes and expenses, so let's go through that. In terms of employment-related expenses, there are some expenses that are specific to being a doctor and being a part of a unionized workforce, and other expenses that are specific to being an employee in Canada. But to skim over the details, because I don't think that's really relevant, the total amount of employment-related expenses that I paid in 2023 was approximately $6,500. After expenses, that took my income down to $74,627.98. But of course, we live in Canada, so we have services like public education, public health care, roads, and obviously the way that we pay for these types of services is through our taxes. Based on my income, I had a 19.25% average marginal tax rate, meaning that I paid approximately $14,325.88 in taxes, bringing my final after expense and after tax income to the number that you saw at the beginning of the video, $60,262.09. So once again, after almost 3 decades of formal education and 3 years of residency, I am making slightly less than the average Canadian makes here in Canada. Had I gotten my bus driver's license straight out of high school and started working right away, I would probably be in a much better financial position than I currently am now. But to show you guys that there is light at the end of the tunnel, let's look at what happens to doctors' incomes right here in Canada after they graduate from residency. According to a 2017 Canadian Medical Association workforce study, family doctors in Canada earned an average of approximately $308,317. But it's important to keep in mind that most doctors here in Canada are not treated as regular employees. We're treated as what's called a sole proprietor or independent contractor, which means that we have to pay for the operating expenses of running a medical practice. The same study found that family doctors across the country had an average overhead percentage of 27%, which means that 27% of their earned income went to things like staff salary, equipment, supplies, and other necessities that are essential to keep their practice up and running. So after subtracting a 27% overhead cost, that brings the average family doctor's income down to $225,071.41. But of course, we all have to pay taxes. So assuming they're earning all of that income as a personal salary, that would mean that their average marginal tax rate is approximately 35.19% here in Ontario, bringing their final after-tax income down to $145,868.78. Now, I won't get into the nitty-gritty in this video because it can get quite complicated, but a lot of doctors here in Canada choose to go through a process called incorporation, where they create a mini company and employ themselves to work for that company so that they can keep most of their earned income within the corporation, benefiting from lower federal and provincial corporate tax rates while paying themselves a salary that is sufficient enough to sustain the lifestyle that they're interested in living as an individual. Ophthalmologists are amongst the highest earners out of all Canadian physicians, and that's really because the technologies that allow them to do the surgeries that they perform have gotten so advanced that they can do their surgeries really quickly compared to how long it used to take them before these technologies came into play. According to that same 2017 study, ophthalmologists earned an average of $809,557 across the country. They paid an average of 40% in terms of overhead, which is relatively high compared to other specialties, once again, because of all these technologies that they use to perform their surgeries. And after expenses, that brought them down to approximately $485,734, which means that their average marginal tax rate was approximately 44.95%. 2.5%, and their final take-home pay would have been on average $267,400 if they chose to take all that income as personal salary rather than leaving it in a corporation. Psychiatrists across the country earned an average of $311,334 with a 19% overhead, bringing them down to $252,180, and they paid an average marginal tax rate of 37% based on that income, which means that their take-home pay was approximately $158,866. Cardiologists weren't necessarily hurting either. They earned an average of $625,455, paying 23% overhead brought that down to $481,600. And once again, the taxman took approximately half, so they paid 44.88%, bringing them to a take-home pay of $265,479. And finally, I thought it would be fun to include the emergency medicine docs because most, if not all, Canadians would have had an encounter with an emergency room physician at some point in their life. So once again, according to this 2017 study, they earned an average of $390,195. They paid 13% in overhead because most of their overhead was covered by the hospital. They do, once again, work out of emergency departments after all, which means that they earned an after expense income of $339,469, and they paid 41.25% in terms of their average marginal tax rate, bringing them to a final take-home pay of $199,430. If you're someone that has the aptitude and ability to get into medical school, get through residency, and become an attending physician, you probably could be quite successful in lots of other fields as well. That's not necessarily to turn you off of your dream of pursuing the field, but if finances are a significant motivating factor, I would definitely take a step back. That being said, if you're willing to put up with sacrifices, you're willing to put in those long hours, and you think you'll genuinely enjoy the career of being a doctor, it does come with, of course, immense gratification, immense career satisfaction. And once we get to about 40 or 50, we start to catch up to our peers that may have gone into trade school and started earning an income shortly after graduation from high school. If you're interested in a lifetime earned income analysis of a doctor compared to a bus driver, go ahead and click the video in the top hand corner. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for joining the video. Please do hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video.